Welcome to What If SleepStorian, where the boundaries between worlds dissolve and beloved characters step beyond the pages of their original tales. Here, in the hushed hours between day and night, a brilliant mind might find itself ensnared by a shadowy will, where the sharp edge of reason could meet the beguiling haze of influence, and the impossible becomes beautifully inevitable. Each story begins with a simple question, what if? And unfolds into a gentle tapestry of intrigue, wonder and dreams. Tonight, we begin with something a little melancholic, a little sinister, a tale woven from the fog and flicker of a city caught in the grip of its own secrets. If these stories bring you comfort or spark your imagination, I'd be grateful if you'd like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. Let me know where in the world you're listening from. I love seeing how far these stories travel, so dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and let these whispered narratives carry you softly towards sleep. Imagine, if you will, the London of 1895, a city draped in a veil of gaslight and shadow. This wasn't the London of grand novels or romantic paintings, with their promises of glittering balls and polished hansoms gliding through pristine streets. No. This was a city of grit and grime, where the air hung heavy with the acrid bite of coal smoke, the sour tang of unwashed bodies, and the faint cloying sweetness of decay from the Thames. The streets were alive with sound, the clatter of hooves on cobblestone, the distant cry of a costermonger hawking wilted cabbages, the soft hiss of gas lamps struggling against the damp. Touch the walls of a narrow alley, and your fingers would come away slick with soot or damp with the seep of some unseen leak. Taste the air, and you'd find it bitter, like licking the edge of a penny left too long in a pocket. And the sights. Oh, the sights. A maze of crooked buildings leaning toward one another as if sharing secrets, their windows glowing faintly with the yellow haze of candlelight or the sickly green of gas. This was a city where beauty and hardship walked hand in hand, where every corner held both a dream and a danger. Can you imagine the smell of the air back then? The way it clung to your clothes, a mix of smoke and sweat and something faintly metallic, like the promise of rain that never quite came. Picture yourself standing on a street corner in Whitechapel or Soho. The cobblestones slick beneath your boots, the fog so thick you could barely see the next lamppost. This was the London where survival was a daily act of defiance, where the poor scraped by in cramped tenements, their breath visible in the chill of unheated rooms, while the wealthy hid their own struggles behind velvet curtains and locked doors. It was a city of contrasts, where the glow of progress, electric lights just beginning to flicker in the wealthier squares, stood in stark relief against the darkness of alleys where no light dared linger. In London, on a night when the fog seemed to press closer than usual, a man moved through the streets with a purpose that cut through the haze. His coat was long and black, its edges frayed from years of use, but it hung on him with an elegance that spoke of a mind too sharp to be dulled by the city's weight. His eyes, keen and unyielding, scanned the shadows as he walked, noting the scuff of a boot in the mud, the faint glint of a discarded cigarette end, the way a curtain twitched in a window above. This was Sherlock Holmes, a name that carried weight in certain circles, a man whose mind was a blade honed by logic, slicing through the chaos of human behaviour to find the truth beneath. He did not walk these streets for pleasure, but for answers, for the city had begun to whisper of something strange, something that unsettled even a femme. The whispers had started weeks ago, faint at first, like ripples on the surface of a still pond. A banker in Mayfair, known for his rigid discipline, had been seen wandering the docks at midnight, his eyes vacant, his hands trembling as he muttered words no one could understand. A young heiress, poised to inherit a fortune, had given away her jewels to a street musician, her face serene but empty, as if her will had been drained like water from a glass. A politician, once a fiery orator, had fallen silent in Parliament, his gaze fixed on some unseen point, his voice lost to a monotone that chilled those who heard it. These were not isolated incidents, Holmes had noted, but threads in a larger web, one spun with care and cunning. And at the heart of that web, he suspected, was a figure whose name was spoken only in hushed tones, Svengali. And like him, what would you have done in a world like this, where the line between your thoughts and another's will began to blur? Imagine standing in those narrow streets, the lamplight flickering, the air heavy with the weight of unseen eyes watching from the dar. Holmes felt that weight now as he moved through Whitechapel, his cane tapping lightly against the cobblestones, a rhythm to steady his thoughts. The city was a labyrinth, not just of streets, but of minds, and somewhere within it a predator was at work, not one who struck with a knife or a fist, but with something far more insidious. Hypnotism, they called it, a word that carried both fascination and fear in these modern times. It was not magic, Holmes knew, but a science of the mind, a manipulation of will that could turn a man into a puppet without him ever feeling the strings. The fog thickened as he turned into a narrow alley, the kind where the walls seemed to close in, their bricks cold and damp against his shoulder as he brushed past. The air here was sharper, tinged with the sourness of stale beer and the faint, sickly sweetness of opium smoke drifting from some hidden den. He paused, his breath a faint cloud in the chill, and listened. Somewhere nearby, a violin wept, its notes thin and mournful, as if the instrument itself were grieving. Holmes's fingers tightened around the head of his cane, his mind sifting through the sounds, the smells, the subtle shifts in the air. He was searching for a clue, a trace of the man whose influence seemed to seep into the city like poison into a vein. Svengali. The name had come to him through Dr. Watson, his friend and chronicler, who had heard it whispered in a tavern by a singer whose voice had once charmed the salons of Paris. She had spoken of a man with eyes like burning coals, a voice that could wrap around your thoughts and pull them loose, a presence that lingered long after he was gone. Watson, ever the sceptic, had dismissed it as the ravings of a woman lost to laudanum, but Holmes had seen the pattern. The banker, the heiress, the politician, they were not random victims, but pieces in a game, chosen for their power, their wealth, their influence. Someone was weaving a web, and Svengali was at its centre. Holmes stepped out of the alley and onto a broader street, where the gas lamps cast long shadows that danced like spectres across the pavement. The city was alive, even at this hour, with the clatter of a late hansom cab, the distant shout of a night watchman, the soft rustle of a woman's skirts as she hurried past, her face hidden beneath a hood. He watched her go, noting the way her steps faltered, as if she were unsure of her own destination. Another thread, perhaps, or merely a soul lost to the city's endless churn. He filed the observation away, his mind a ledger of details, each one a potential key to the puzzle. The trail led him to a small theatre in Soho, its marquee faded but still legible, an evening of song and sentiment. The building was unremarkable, its brick facade stained with years of soot, its windows dark save for a single light burning in an upper room. Holmes stood across the street, his silhouette blending with the fog, and watched. The theatre was a place where dreams were sold, where voices could stir the heart or soothe it to sleep. It was the kind of place Svengali might choose, a stage for his peculiar talents. Holmes had read of the man's performances in Paris, where he had turned a young singer into a sensation, her voice a marvel that seemed to come not from her but through her, as if she were a vessel for something greater, or something darker. Imagine the chill of the air against your skin, the way it seeps into your bones, the faint prickle of unease as you realise you're not alone in the dark. Holmes felt it too, though his face betrayed nothing. He crossed the street, his steps silent now, and slipped into the alley beside the theatre. The door was ajar, a sliver of warmth spilling out into the cold, and with it came the sound of a voice, low, melodic, almost too soft to hear, yet it carried a weight that made the air feel heavier. He pushed the door open, just enough to slip inside, and found himself in a narrow corridor lit by a single candle. The walls were lined with posters, their colours faded but their promises still bold. Singers, dancers, magicians, all vying for the attention of a city that never slept. The voice grew clearer as he moved deeper, not singing now, but speaking, a rhythm that was both soothing and commanding. Holmes's hand rested lightly on the revolver in his pocket, not out of fear, but habit, a reminder that reason alone was not always enough in a world where minds could be bent. The corridor opened into a small room, its air thick with the scent of wax and dust, and there, seated at a table, was a man whose presence seemed to fill the space. His eyes were dark, almost too dark, and they fixed on Holmes with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. His voice, when he spoke, was a low hum, like the drone of a cello string, and it carried a question that hung in the air like smoke. "You seek answers, Mr. Holmes," the man said, his lips curling into a smile that was both welcoming and predatory. "But are you prepared for what you'll find?" The fog outside seemed to press closer, as if the city itself were holding its breath, and in that moment Holmes knew he had stepped into the heart of the web. The air in the small room was heavy, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of countless whispered secrets. The candle's flame flickered, casting shadows that seemed to writhe across the peeling wallpaper, and the scent of melted wax mingled with the faint musk of old velvet curtains, long past their prime. Sherlock Holmes stood motionless, his silhouette sharp against the dim glow, his eyes locked on the man before him. The stranger's voice lingered in the air, its cadence smooth yet laced with an undercurrent that made the skin prickle, like the brush of a cold finger down the spine. This was Svengali, though he had not yet named himself, and Holmes felt the man's gaze like a weight, probing, searching for a crack in the armour of his mind. The city outside was a distant murmur now, its clatter and cries muffled by the theatre's thick walls. But even here, in this claustrophobic space, London's pulse seemed to seep through, the faint tang of coal dust on the tongue, the damp chill that clung to the skin, the soft creak of floorboards underfoot, worn smooth by years of restless feet. This was no place of grandeur, no glittering stage for the city's elite. It was a forgotten corner, where dreams were spun for those who could afford little else, where the air tasted of desperation and the promise of escape. Holmes's senses catalogued it all. The uneven grain of the wooden table, the faint sourness of spilled wine staining its surface, the way the candlelight caught the glint of a silver ring on the stranger's finger, its surface etched with symbols too faint to read. Svengali leaned back in his chair, his movements languid, almost theatrical, as if he were performing for an audience of one. His eyes, dark and unblinking, held Holmes's gaze, and there was something in them, not malice, not exactly, but a hunger, a need to unravel the man before him. "You're not like the others," he said, his voice a low hum, each word placed with care like notes in a melody. "Your mind does not bend easily, does it, Mr. Holmes? It is a fortress, built of logic and steel, but even fortresses have their weaknesses." Holmes's expression did not waver, though his mind raced, sifting through the man's words, his posture, the subtle tilt of his head. He was no stranger to those who wielded charm as a weapon, but this was different. There was a rhythm to Svengali's speech, a cadence that seemed to pulse in time with the listener's breath, drawing them closer, lulling them into a state where resistance felt like an afterthought. Holmes felt it, not as a compulsion but as a pressure, like the weight of deep water pressing against a diver's chest. He stood straighter, grounding himself in the details of the room, the faint crackle of the candle's wick, the rough texture of his coat against his wrists, the cold metal of the revolver still tucked in his pocket. Outside, the fog curled tighter around the city, wrapping London in a shroud that muffled its edges and blurred its truths. The streets were alive with their own stories, a beggar muttering to himself as he warmed his hands over a brazier, the sharp clink of a coin tossed into a tin cup, the soft sob of a child lost in the maze of alleys. This was the London of 1895, a city where survival demanded vigilance, where the poor scraped by on crusts and cunning, and the powerful hid their fears behind locked doors and false smiles. Holmes knew this world intimately, its patterns and its chaos, but now he sensed something new, a distortion in the fabric of human behaviour, as if someone had plucked a string and set the whole city vibrating with unease. "I seek only the truth," Holmes said, his voice steady, cutting through the hum of Svengali's words, "and I suspect you know more of it than most." He stepped closer, his cane resting lightly against the floor, a subtle anchor in the shifting air. The movement was deliberate, a reminder that he was no passive observer. He noted the way Svengali's fingers twitched, the slight tightening of his jaw, the faintest flicker of surprise in those dark eyes. The man was accustomed to control, to holding others in his sway, but Holmes was no easy prey. Svengali's smile widened, though it did not reach his eyes. "The truth," he murmured, as if tasting the word. "A noble pursuit, but a lonely one. Tell me, Mr. Holmes, do you ever tire of chasing shadows, of seeing the world as a puzzle to be solved, rather than a song to be sung?" He rose from his chair, his movements fluid, almost serpentine, and crossed to a small table where a decanter of amber liquid gleamed in the candlelight. The scent of brandy filled the air, sharp and sweet, as he poured a glass and offered it to Holmes, who declined with a slight shake of his head. Holmes watched the man closely, noting the elegance of his gestures, the way his voice seemed to wrap around each syllable, making even a simple question feel like an invitation. This was the art of hypnotism, he realized. Not a spell or a trance, but a careful manipulation of attention, a weaving of words and presence that could make the mind pliable. He had read of such techniques in the works of Charcot and Bernheim, the scientists who probe the mysteries of the human psyche, but Svengali was no scholar. He was a practitioner, a maestro of influence, and his stage was the city itself. The room seemed to grow smaller, the walls pressing in as the candle's light wavered. Holmes's mind, ever disciplined, catalogued the details. The faint creak of the floor as Svengali shifted his weight, the soft rustle of his sleeve as he lifted the glass to his lips, the way the brandy caught the light, refracting it into 1,000 tiny sparks. These were the anchors that kept him grounded, the facts that held the world in place. But he could not ignore the undercurrent, the way Svengali's presence seemed to fill the space, making the air feel charged, like the moment before a storm. "You speak of shadows," Holmes said, his tone calm but edged with steel. "But shadows are cast by something real. I am here to find it." He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Svengali's, searching for the telltale signs of deceit. A flicker of the gaze, a tightening of the lips, a bead of sweat at the temple. There was none. Only that unyielding stare, those eyes that seemed to see too much, to know too much. Svengali laughed, a soft musical sound that seemed to linger in the air. "You are a man of reason, Mr. Holmes, but reason alone cannot unravel every mystery. Some truths lie beyond the reach of logic, in the spaces where the heart and the mind blur." He set the glass down, the clink of crystal against wood sharp in the silence, and leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "What if I told you that I could show you those spaces, that I could make you see the world as it truly is?" Holmes felt the words like a current, pulling at the edges of his thoughts, but he anchored himself in the details, the rough texture of the table under his fingertips, the faint smell of dust in the air, the steady rhythm of his own breath. He was not here to be swayed, but to understand, to trace the threads of this web back to their source. Svengali was a puzzle, a challenge to his deductive prowess, and Holmes would not be distracted by the man's theatrics. The city outside stirred, a distant shout breaking the silence, the clatter of a cart's wheels fading into the fog. Holmes glanced toward the window, where the single pane was fogged with condensation, a faint veil that blurred the world beyond. The glass was cold to the touch, its surface slick with the breath of the city. and through it the gas lamps outside glowed like distant stars caught in a net of mist. The room, small and close, seemed to pulse with the weight of Svengali's presence, his voice still lingering in the air, a low hum that seemed to seep into the walls themselves. Holmes stood rooted, his senses sharp, his mind a blade cutting through the haze of the man's words. This was no ordinary encounter, no simple exchange of wits. Svengali was a force, a shadow cast across the city, and Holmes felt the edges of that shadow now, pressing against the boundaries of his reason. "You claim to free them," Holmes said, stepping closer, his voice a steady pulse in the dim room. "Yet you bind them to your will. That is not freedom, sir. That is control." His cane rested lightly against the floor, its tip a point of contact with the world, a reminder of the solid ground beneath his feet. He was close now, close enough to smell the faint spice of Svengali's breath, to see the pulse at the base of his throat quickening just slightly. Svengali straightened, his smile unwavering but his eyes narrowing, a flicker of something, irritation, perhaps, or amusement. "You are a man of absolutes, Mr. Holmes, but the mind is not so simple. It is a sea of desires, fears, dreams. I merely navigate its currents." He moved toward the door, his steps silent, his presence filling the space like smoke. "You will find your answers, but they may not be what you expect." Holmes watched him go, the door closing softly behind him, the room suddenly lighter, as if a weight had lifted. But the city outside remained heavy, its fog pressing against the window, its sounds a distant reminder of the world's unyielding grip. Holmes stood alone, his mind already tracing the threads of Svengali's web, knowing that the true battle had only just begun. Holmes watched him go, the door closing softly behind him, the sound of a faint sigh in the heavy air of the theatre. The room seemed to breathe again, the candle's flame steadying its light casting long shadows across the peeling walls. The scent of brandy lingered, sharp and sweet, mingling with the musty dampness of the theatre's curtains, their velvet worn thin by time and neglect. Holmes stood alone, his fingers brushing the edge of his cane, the wood cool and solid, grounding him in the silence that followed. Outside, the fog pressed against the window, a thick grey curtain that muffled the city's heartbeat. The distant clop of hooves, the low cry of a night vendor, the faint wail of a violin drifting from some unseen corner. This was London in 1895, a city of shadows and survival, where every breath carried the weight of coal dust and dreams deferred. His mind was already at work, sifting through the encounter like a jeweller examining a flawed gem. Svengali's words had been a performance, each syllable polished to draw the listener in, to blur the line between choice and compulsion. Yet there were cracks in the facade, the faint tremor in his hand, the flicker of unease in his eyes when Holmes pressed too close. These were the tales of a man who wielded control but feared its limits. Holmes stepped to the window, wiping a hand across the fogged glass, the cold biting at his fingertips. The street below was a blur, the gas lamps smudged into halos of light, and he felt the city's pulse, its rhythm of struggle and secrets, calling him back into its maze. Can you picture yourself there, standing in that small shadowed room, the air thick with the scent of wax and dust, the world outside hidden by fog? Imagine the chill of the glass against your skin, the way the city's sounds seem to whisper just beyond your hearing. What would it feel like to chase a truth that slips through your fingers like smoke? To face a man whose power lies not in force but in the quiet bending of wills? Holmes felt that weight now, not as fear but as a challenge, a puzzle that demanded every ounce of his intellect. He turned from the window, his coat sweeping the floor, and moved toward the door, his steps deliberate, each one a declaration of intent. The theatre's corridors were a labyrinth of their own, narrow and dim, the air heavy with the smell of old wood and forgotten roses, as if the memory of bouquets tossed to long-gone singers still lingered. The walls were lined with posters, their edges curling like the pages of an ancient book, promising wonders that had faded into obscurity. Holmes's eyes scanned them as he passed, noting the names, the dates, the faces frozen in moments of triumph or despair. One caught his attention, a faded sketch of a woman, her eyes wide and haunting, her lips parted as if caught mid-song. Below her image, a single word, Trilby. He filed it away, a thread in the web he was beginning to trace, and moved on, his cane tapping softly against the floor, a steady rhythm against the city's chaos. Outside, the fog had thickened, wrapping the streets in a cocoon that dulls the senses. The air was sharp with the bite of coal smoke, the faint tang of river mud, and something sweeter, almost sickly, like overripe fruit left to rot in an alley. Holmes pulled his scarf tighter, the wool rough against his chin, and stepped into the night. His senses alive to the city's pulse. The cobblestones were slick underfoot, gleaming faintly in the gaslight, and the sounds of London came in fragments. A woman's laughter, sharp and fleeting, the creak of a shutter swinging in the wind, the low growl of a dog scavenging in the shadows. This was not the London of guidebooks or gaslit fantasies, but a city of raw edges, where survival was a daily negotiation, where the poor huddled in doorways and the wealthy locked their fears behind iron gates. Holmes's destination was Baker Street, where Dr. Watson would be waiting, his steady presence a counterpoint to the city's unease. The journey took him through Soho's tangled streets, where the air was alive with the clink of glasses, the murmur of voices, the faint strains of a piano spilling from a tavern. He passed a flower girl, her hands chapped and red, her basket of wilted violets giving off a faint, desperate sweetness. She looked up as he passed, her eyes dull with exhaustion, and Holmes noted the way her shoulders slumped, as if the city itself were pressing her down. Another thread, perhaps, or merely another soul caught in London's grind. What would you have done in those narrow streets, with the fog curling around you like a living thing, the air heavy with the city's breath? Imagine the weight of it, the way it clings to your skin, the faint taste of soot on your tongue. Holmes moved through it with purpose, his mind a map of details, each one a clue to the larger pattern. Svengali's influence was spreading, a shadow that touched the powerful and the powerless alike, and Holmes knew he could not unravel it alone. Watson, with his pragmatism and loyalty, would be his anchor, his lens to see the human cost of this strange, insidious game. The door to 221B Baker Street was a familiar weight under his hand, the wood worn smooth by years of comings and goings. Inside, the air was warmer, scented with tobacco, and the faint, comforting aroma of Mrs. Hudson's tea left cooling on the sideboard. Watson sat by the fire, his face lit by the glow, his fingers tapping restlessly against the arm of his chair, the leather worn smooth by years of quiet evenings and urgent discussions. He looked up as Holmes entered, his eyes narrowing at the sight of his friend's expression, the sharp lines of concentration etched deeper than usual. "Holmes," Watson said, rising, his voice steady but tinged with concern, "you look as if you've seen a ghost." The firelight flickered across his face, casting shadows that danced like the doubts in his mind. He gestured to a chair, but Holmes remained standing, his coat still damp from the fog, the chill of the night clinging to him like a second skin. "Not a ghost, Watson," Holmes said, his voice low, measured, each word chosen with care. "A shadow, one that casts a long reach over this city." He moved to the mantel, his fingers brushing the edge of a tobacco tin, its metal cool and smooth, grounding him as he began to recount the encounter. The room was a haven, its familiar scents and sounds. The crackle of the fire, the faint creak of the floorboards, the bitter tang of coal dust that always seemed to linger, a stark contrast to the theatre's oppressive air. Yet even here, the weight of Svengali's presence seemed to follow, a faint echo in Holmes's thoughts. He spoke of the man's voice, its hypnotic cadence, the way it seemed to weave through the mind like a thread through cloth. Watson listened, his brow furrowed, his fingers tightening around the arm of his chair. the leather creaking softly under his grip. "Hypnotism," Watson muttered, his tone sceptical but not dismissive. "You think he's controlling these people? Turning their minds against them?" His voice carried the weight of a doctor's pragmatism, but there was a flicker of unease, a recognition of the mind's fragility. Holmes nodded, his eyes fixed on the fire, its flames a dance of light and shadow. Not controlling, Watson, influencing, guiding their desires to align with his own. It is a subtle art, one that preys on the weaknesses we all carry within us. He paused, his mind tracing the threads of the banker, the heiress, the politician, each a piece in a larger design, each a victim of their own hidden longings. The room felt smaller now, the air thick with the weight of what was at stake. London was a city of millions, each mind a potential target, each a thread in Svengali's web. Picture yourself there, the scent of tobacco and tea in the air, the faint taste of soot on your tongue, the crackle of the fire a reminder of the world's relentless march. What would it feel like to know that a single man could bend the will of another, not with force but with a voice, a glance, a moment of weakness? Holmes felt it keenly, the challenge of a foe who fought not with weapons but with the very fabric of the human mind. He turned to Watson, his voice steady but urgent. "We must find the source of his power, Watson, not in some mystical sense, but in the practical, the places he frequents, the people he influences, the patterns of his movements. He's no phantom, but a man, and men leave traces." Holmes's fingers tapped against the mantel, a rhythm to match the city's pulse, his mind already mapping the next steps. The theatre was a starting point, but Svengali was a shadow, moving through London's underbelly, his influence spreading like ink in water. Watson leaned forward, his eyes sharp now, the soldier's instinct rising to meet the detective's call. "Where do we begin?" he asked, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of Holmes's thoughts. The firelight caught the lines of his face, the weariness of a man who had seen too much yet stood ready for more. Holmes's gaze shifted to the window, where the fog pressed close, a reminder of the city waiting beyond. "We begin where the threads converge," he said, his voice a quiet blade cutting through the haze. "The theatre, the streets, the minds he has touched. We follow the web, Watson, until we find its heart." The fire crackled, its warmth a fleeting comfort against the cold truth of what lay ahead. Holmes stepped toward the door, his coat still heavy with the night's damp, his mind alight with the puzzle of Svengali's web. The city was waiting, its secrets buried in the fog, and he would not almost rest until they were laid bare. He stepped toward the door, his coat still heavy with the night's damp, his mind alight with the puzzle of Svengali's web. The air in 221B Baker Street was warm, a cocoon of firelight and familiarity, but it could not dull the sharp edge of his thoughts. Watson nodded, his fingers brushing the edge of his chair, the leather creaking softly under his touch. "You think he's targeting more than just the wealthy?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with the weight of what they faced. "These incidents, they're not random, are they?" Holmes's eyes narrowed, the flame's reflection glinting in their depths. "Nothing about Svengali is random," he said, striking a match, the sulphur's sharp tang cutting through the air. "He chooses his targets with care, those with influence, those who shape the city's course. A banker controls wealth, an heiress sways society, a politician steers the law. He is not merely bending minds, he is bending London itself." The match's flame flickered, casting a brief glow across his face before he lit the pipe, the smoke curling upward like a ghost of the fog outside. The city beyond was a living thing, its streets a maze of ambition and despair. The fog was a shroud, hiding the jagged edges of a world where survival demanded cunning, where the poor scraped by in alleys thick with the stench of refuse and despair, and the wealthy hid their fears behind locked doors and false smiles. The air was heavy with the acrid bite of coal smoke, the faint sweetness of rotting fruit from market stalls, the metallic tang of river water that clung to the docks. To walk those streets was to feel the city's pulse, its rhythm of clattering hooves, shouted curses, and the soft sob of a child lost in the crowd. This was not the London of poets or painters, but a city of raw survival, where every step was a negotiation with fate. Holmes moved to the window, parting the curtain to reveal the fog's grey veil. The gas lamps outside reduced to faint smudges of light. His breath fogged the glass, a fleeting cloud that mirrored the city's haze, and he felt the weight of the task ahead. Svengali's web was not merely a matter of individual minds. It was a threat to the city's soul, a manipulation that could shift the balance of power in ways even he could not yet fully predict. He turned back to Watson, who had taken up his notebook, the scratch of his pen a steady rhythm against the fire's crackle. "We'll start with the theatre," Holmes said, his voice a quiet blade cutting through the room's warmth. "But we must also trace the victims, their movements, their connections, the moments when their wills faltered. There will be patterns, Watson, and patterns are the language of truth." He drew on his pipe, the smoke's bitter edge grounding him further, his mind already sifting through the details of the night. Svengali's voice, his gestures, the faint name Trilby on the poster, a clue yet to be unravelled. Watson's pen paused, his eyes lifting to meet Holmes's. "And if he's as dangerous as you say?" he asked, his tone steady but heavy with the weight of their shared history. "If he can bend minds with a word, a glance, how do we fight that?" Holmes's lips twitched, a faint smile that held no warmth. "We fight with clarity, Watson, with reason. His power lies in the shadows of the mind, but shadows dissolve in the light of truth." He stepped away from the window, the curtain falling back into place, shutting out the fog's embrace. The room was a haven, but it was also a starting point, a place to gather strength before plunging back into the city's depths. The night wore on, the fire burning low, its embers glowing like the last sparks of hope in a weary world. Holmes sat at the table, his fingers tracing the edge of a map of London, its lines a labyrinth of possibility. The city was a puzzle, its streets and souls intertwined, and Svengali was a shadow moving through it, leaving traces only a mind like Holmes could follow. He marked the theatre in Soho, the docks where the banker had wandered, the salon where the heiress had given away her jewels. Each was a point in the web, a thread to be followed, and he knew the answers lay not in the grand gestures but in the small overlooked details, a glance, a pause, a name whispered in the dark. Picture, if you will, the weight of that moment, the fire's fading glow casting shadows across the room, the city outside waiting like a beast in the fog. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and ink, the faint taste of tea lingering on the tongue, the soft creak of the floorboards a reminder of the world's restless pulse. Holmes felt it all, his senses alive to the challenge, his mind a blade honed to cut through the haze of Svengali's influence. The city was calling, its secrets buried in the fog, and he would answer step by step until the web was unravelled. He rose, his coat still heavy with the night's damp, and turned to Watson, who had set his notebook aside, his eyes sharp with resolve. "Rest now, Watson," Holmes said, his voice soft but firm, a promise of the work to come. "Tomorrow we hunt a shadow." The fire's last embers flickered, casting a final glow across the room, and the city outside waited, its fog a silent witness to the battle that lay ahead. The fire's last embers flickered, casting a final glow across the room, and the city outside waited, its fog a silent witness to the battle that lay ahead. Sherlock Holmes stood by the table at 221B Baker Street, his fingers tracing the worn edges of a London map, its lines a labyrinth of secrets waiting to be unravelled. The air was heavy with the fading scent of tobacco, now mingling with the damp chill seeping through the window, where the fog pressed close, blurring the gas lamps into faint smudges of light. The sounds of the city were a distant murmur, the soft clatter of a cart's wheels, the low moan of a foghorn from the Thames, the faint rustle of leaves skittering across cobblestones. This was London in 1895, a city of shadows and survival, where the air carried the acrid bite of coal smoke, the sour tang of river mud, and the faint sweetness of decay from forgotten corners. Holmes's mind was a machine, its gears turning as he pieced together the threads of Svengali's web. The banker wandering the docks, the heiress stripped of her jewels, the politician silenced in Parliament, each was a note in a discordant symphony, a pattern that pointed to a mind weaving influence with surgical precision. The name Trilby lingered in his thoughts, a clue to Svengali's past, a key to his power. He glanced at Watson, who sat by the fire, his face etched with quiet resolve, the leather of his chair creaking softly under his weight. The room was a haven, its warmth a fleeting shield against the city's weight, but Holmes knew they could not linger. The fog outside hid Svengali's next move, and the dawn was their signal to act. He moved to the door, his coat still heavy with the night's damp, the wool rough against his shoulders. "Come, Watson," he said, his voice a steady pulse in the quiet, cutting through the room's stillness. "The city is his stage, and we must find its hidden corners before the curtain rises." Watson rose, his boots scuffing against the floorboards, the sound a faint echo of their shared purpose. The air outside was sharp, laced with the bitter tang of coal, and the faint, sickly sweetness of rotting fruit from an alley's refuse. The fog curled around them like a living thing, its chill seeping into their bones, the cobblestones slick and gleaming underfoot. The gas lamps flickered, their lights swallowed by the haze, and the city's pulse was a fragmented song, a shouted curse, the creak of a shutter, the soft sob of a child lost in the maze of streets. Their path led back to Soho, to the theatre where Svengali's shadow had first taken shape. The streets were a warren of secrets, their walls stained with soot and time, the air thick with the sourness of spilled ale and the faint perfume of wilting flowers left unsold by a street vendor. Holmes's senses were alive, noting the scuff of a boot in the mud, the glint of a broken bottle in the gutter, the faint twitch of a curtain in a window above. This was not the London of grand balls or polished hansoms, but a city of raw survival, where the poor scraped by in alleys reeking of despair, and the wealthy hide their fears behind locked gates and false smiles. The theatre loomed ahead, its brick facade a dark silhouette against the fog, its windows dark save for a faint glow from within, like a single eye watching the night. Holmes paused at the alley's edge, his cane resting lightly against the ground, its tip a point of contact with the world's solidity. Watson stood beside him, his breath a faint cloud in the chill, his hand resting on the revolver in his pocket, a silent vow of readiness. The air was heavy with the scent of damp stone and old wood, the faint metallic tang of rust from the theatre's iron gate. Holmes's eyes scanned the building, noting the fresh scratches around the lock, the scuff of mud on the doorstep, the subtle signs of recent passage. Inside the theatre was a crypt of shadows, its air thick with the dust of forgotten dreams. The corridor was dim, lit by a single gas lamp that flickers like a faltering heartbeat, casting long shadows across the walls. The posters remained, their faded faces staring out like ghosts, and Holmes's gaze lingered on the one marked Trilby, her eyes wide and haunting, her lips parted as if caught in a song she could not escape. The name was a thread, a link to Svengali's past, and he followed it deeper, his steps silent, his senses attuned to the air's subtle shifts, the faint creak of a floorboard, the soft rustle of fabric, the distant hum of a voice that lingered like smoke. The stage was a cavern of darkness, its curtains drawn tight, the air heavy with the scent of wax and old velvet. Holmes paused at the edge, his eyes adjusting to the gloom, and there in the centre of the stage stood Svengali. He was not alone. A woman stood beside him, her figure slight, her face pale and serene, her eyes fixed on some unseen point. Her lips moved silently, as if singing a song only she could hear. Holmes recognised her. Trilby, The singer whose voice had once captivated Paris, now a shadow of herself, her will bound to Svengali's command. The air grew heavier, the theatre a crucible where minds collided. Svengali's voice was a low hum, his words a melody that seemed to wrap around Trilby like a chain, each syllable a link in her captivity. Watson's breath caught, a faint sound in the silence, and Holmes raised a hand, signalling caution. They stood in the shadows, their presence masked by the gloom, watching as Svengali's gaze held Trilby, his eyes dark and unyielding, a blade that cut through her defences. Holmes saw it now, the mechanism of his power, not supernatural but human, a manipulation of trust and longing, exploiting the mind's hidden fractures. "You cannot hide, Mr. Holmes," Svengali said suddenly, his voice slicing through the darkness, sharp and clear. He had not turned, had not looked their way, but his words were a challenge, a recognition of the game's final act. Trilby's head tilted slightly, her eyes still vacant, her lips still moving in that silent song. Holmes stepped forward, his cane tapping lightly against the stage, a deliberate rhythm to anchor the moment. "I do not hide," Holmes said, his voice a steady counterpoint to Svengali's melody, cutting through the haze. "I seek, and I have found you." He moved onto the stage, Watson at his side, the air thick with the scent of dust and wax, the faint taste of metal lingering on the tongue. The gas lamp flickered, its light casting shadows that danced like spectres, and Holmes felt the city's pulse, its weight pressing in from all sides. Svengali turned, his eyes dark pools that swallowed the light, his smile a thin line without warmth. "You think your logic can unravel my work?" he asked, his voice a low hum, each word a note designed to soothe, to sway. "I give them freedom, Mr. Holmes, the freedom to be what they truly desire." His hand gestured toward Trilby, her serene face a mask of compliance, her trembling hands betraying the struggle within. Holmes's gaze shifted to her, noting the faint quiver of her lips, the spark of awareness buried deep in her eyes. "Freedom is not a chain," he said, his voice a blade sharp and unyielding. "You have bound her as you have bound others, but chains can be broken." He stepped closer, his eyes locked on Svengali's, searching for the flaw in his design, the crack in his facade. The theatre seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with the weight of their confrontation. Holmes spoke of the banker, the heiress, the politician, laying out the pattern like a map, each piece a proof of Svengali's manipulation. His voice was a steady rhythm, dismantling the web thread by thread, his logic a light piercing the shadows. Svengali's smile faltered, a flicker of unease in his eyes, and Holmes pressed forward, his words a lifeline to Trilby, calling her back from the abyss. Her eyes cleared, a single tear tracing her cheek, and she stepped back, her hands steadying as she broke free from Svengali's spell. The man's voice faltered, his hands trembling as he retreated, the stage creaking under his weight. "You cannot stop it," he said, but his words were frayed, a melody unravelling. Holmes stood firm, his presence a counterweight, his reason a beacon in the darkness. The fog outside began to lift, the first light of dawn touching the city's edges, and Holmes knew the battle was won, though the war was not over. Svengali's web was broken, its threads snapped by the force of truth, and Trilby stood free, her voice her own once more. The city remained a labyrinth, its secrets buried deep, but Holmes would walk its streets, his mind a shield against the shadows, his resolve a promise of light. The fire's last embers flickered, casting a final glow across the room, and the city outside waited, its fog a silent witness to the battle that lay ahead. Sherlock Holmes stood by the table at 221B Baker Street, his fingers tracing the worn lines of a London map, its edges curling like the pages of a book long unread. The air was thick with the fading scent of tobacco, now overtaken by the damp chill seeping through the window's cracks, where the fog pressed close, blurring the gas lamps into faint smudges of light. The sounds of London were a distant murmur, the soft clatter of a milk cart's wheels, the low moan of a foghorn from the Thames, the faint rustle of leaves caught in the wind's restless dance. This was 1895, a city of shadows and survival, where the air carried the acrid bite of coal smoke, the sour tang of the river mud, and the faint sweetness of decay from alleys where hope went to die. Holmes's mind was a furnace, its flames fed by the puzzle of Svengali's web. The banker wandering the docks at midnight, muttering nonsense, the heiress scattering her jewels to a street musician, the politician silenced in Parliament, his fire snuffed out. Each was a thread in a tapestry of manipulation, woven with a precision that spoke of ambition far beyond personal gain. The name Trilby lingered in his thoughts, a haunting note from Svengali's past, a clue to the heart of his power. He glanced at Watson, who sat by the fire, his face etched with the quiet resolve of a man who had followed Holmes into countless storms. The room was a sanctuary, its walls a bulwark against the city's chaos, but the weight of their task pressed in, heavy as the fog outside. Holmes moved to the door, his coat still damp from the night's chill, the wool rough against his shoulders, its fibres heavy with the scent of soot and mist. "Come, Watson," he said, his voice a steady pulse, cutting through the room's warmth. "The city is his stage, and we must find its hidden corners before his next act begins." Watson rose, his boots scuffing softly against the floorboards, the sound a faint echo of their shared purpose. The air outside hit them like a blade, sharp with the bitter tang of coal and the faint sickly sweetness of rotting fruit from a nearby alley. The fog curled around them, its chill seeping into their bones, the cobblestones slick and gleaming underfoot. The gas lamps flickered, their lights swallowed by the haze, and the city's pulse was a fragmented song, a shouted curse, the creak of a shutter, the soft sob of a child lost in the maze of streets. Their path wound through Soho's tangled alleys, where the walls were stained with soot and time, the air thick with the sourness of spilled ale and the faint perfume of wilting flowers left unsold by a street vendor. Holmes's senses were alive, noting every detail, the scuff of a boot in the mud, the glint of a broken bottle in the gutter, the faint twitch of a curtain in a window above. This was not the London of grand novels or polished hansoms, but a city of raw survival, where the poor scraped by in alleys reeking of despair, and the wealthy hid their fears behind locked gates and false smiles. The theatre loomed ahead, its brick facade a dark silhouette against the fog, its windows dark save for a single, faint glow, like an eye watching the night. Holmes paused at the alley's edge, his cane resting lightly against the ground, its tip a point of contact with the world's solidity. Watson stood beside him, his breath a faint cloud in the chill, his hand resting on the revolver in his pocket, a silent vow of readiness. The air was heavy with the scent of damp stone and old wood, the faint metallic tang of rust from the theatre's iron gate. Holmes's eyes scanned the building, noting the fresh scratches around the lock, the scuff of mud on the doorstep, the subtle signs of a recent passage. The city's pulse was a distant thrum, its sounds muffled by the fog, but here, in this forgotten corner, the air seemed to hum with a different rhythm, one set by Svengali's will. Inside, the theatre was a crypt of shadows, its air thick with the dust of forgotten dreams. The corridor was dim, lit by a single gas lamp that flickers like a faltering heartbeat, casting long shadows across the walls. The posters remained, their faded faces staring out like ghosts, and Holmes's gaze lingered on the one marked Trilby, her eyes wide and haunting, her lips parted as if caught in a song she could not escape. The name was a thread, a link to Svengali's past, and he followed it deeper, his steps silent, his senses attuned to the air's subtle shifts, the faint creak of a floorboard, the soft rustle of fabric, the distant hum of a voice that lingered like smoke. The stage was a cavern of darkness, its curtains drawn tight, the air heavy with the scent of wax and old velvet. Holmes paused at the edge, his eyes adjusting to the gloom, and there, in the centre of the stage, stood Svengali. He was not alone. A woman stood beside him, her figure slight, her face pale and serene, her eyes fixed on some unseen point. Her lips moved silently, as if singing a song only she could hear. Holmes recognised her. Trilby, the singer whose voice had once captivated Paris, now a shadow of herself, her will bound to Svengali's command. Behind her stood others, a man in a banker's coat, his eyes vacant, a woman in fine silks, her hands trembling, a figure in the shadows, his posture rigid, his voice silent. These were Svengali's puppets, their minds ensnared in his web. The air grew heavier, the theatre a crucible where minds collided. Svengali's voice was a low hum, his words a melody that seemed to wrap around his victims like chains, each syllable a link in their captivity. Watson's breath caught, a faint sound in the silence, and Holmes raised a hand, signalling caution. They stood in the shadows, their presence masked by the gloom, watching as Svengali's gaze held Trilby, his eyes dark and unyielding, a blade that cut through her defences. Holmes saw it now. Holmes watched him, his gaze unyielding, his mind a fortress that had withstood the storm. "Your web is broken," he said, his voice a quiet blade, final and unyielding. "The city is not yours to command." Svengali's shoulders slumped, his presence shrinking, a shadow dissolving in the light. He turned, his steps silent now, and slipped into the darkness beyond the stage, his figure swallowed by the theatre's gloom. The air was lighter now, the scent of wax and dust fading, replaced by the faint freshness of dawn seeping through the cracks. Watson stepped forward, his revolver lowered, his face a mix of relief and awe. The figures on the stage dispersed, their steps hesitant but their own, their wills reclaimed from the haze. Holmes stood at the centre, his cane resting lightly against the floor, the wood cool and solid, grounding him in the moment's victory. The city outside stirred, its fog lifting to reveal the first rays of sunlight, glinting off the cobblestones like shards of hope. The sounds of London rose, the clatter of hooves, the cry of a vendor, the soft hum of a city waking to itself. This was not the London of grand dreams, but a city of resilience, its scars worn proudly, its pulse a testament to survival. Holmes and Watson stepped into the dawn, the theatre behind them a silent witness to the battle won. The web was broken, but the city remained a labyrinth, its secrets buried deep, and Holmes knew he would walk its streets, his mind a shield against the shadows, his resolve a promise of light. Holmes and Watson stepped into the dawn, the theatre behind them a silent witness to the battle won. The fog was lifting, its grey veil parting to reveal the first rays of sunlight, glinting off the cobblestones like shards of broken glass. The air was sharp with the morning's chill, carrying the acrid bite of coal smoke, the faint tang of river mud, and the fleeting sweetness of bread baking in a nearby shop, a rare note of warmth in London's relentless grind. The city stirred, its pulse quickening, the clatter of hooves on the street, the sharp cry of a vendor hawking the day's papers, the soft creak of a cart's wheel turning through the muck. This was 1895, a city of scars and resilience, where the poor scraped by in alleys thick with the stench of refuse, and the wealthy hide their fears behind polished doors and guarded smiles. Holmes's coat hung heavy with the night's damp, the wool rough against his shoulders, its fibres steeped in the scent of soot and mist. His cane tapped lightly against the cobblestones, a steady rhythm anchoring his thoughts as he moved through Soho's waking streets. Watson walked beside him, his breath a faint cloud in the chill, his boots scuffing softly against the slick stones, his face set with the quiet determination of a man who had seen the darkness and chosen to follow the light. The victory in the theatre had been hard won. Trilby freed, the banker, heiress, and politician released from Svengali's spell, but Holmes's mind was not at rest. Svengali had slipped into the shadows, his presence a lingering echo, a thread yet to be fully severed. The streets were alive now, their shadows softening in the dawn's light, but the air still carried the weight of the city's secrets. The walls of the narrow alleys were stained with soot, their bricks cold and damp to the touch. and the faint perfume of wilting flowers lingered from a vendor's abandoned basket. Holmes's senses catalogued every detail. The scuff of a boot in the mud, the glint of a discarded coin in the gutter, the faint twitch of a curtain in a window above. This was not the London of grand novels or gaslit fantasies, but a city of raw edges, where survival was a daily negotiation, where every breath was laced with the bitter tang of coal and the faint sweetness of decay. Their path led them toward the Thames, where the river's murky waters lapped against the docks, their surface gleaming faintly in the growing light. The air here was heavier, thick with the scent of tar and salt, the faint metallic tang of rusted iron from the wharves. The docks were waking, their sounds a chorus of labour. The creak of ropes, the shout of a dock worker, the soft splash of water against wooden pilings. Holmes paused, his eyes scanning the scene, noting the way the light caught the ripples, the faint outline of a figure moving in the shadows near a warehouse. Svengali had vanished into the theatre's gloom, but Holmes knew a man like him did not simply disappear. His influence was a poison, seeping into the city's veins, and the docks were a place where shadows thrived. Watson's voice broke the silence, low and steady. "Do you think he's gone for good, Holmes?" he asked, his hand resting on the revolver in his pocket, a habit born of caution. His face was lined with the weariness of the night, but his eyes were sharp, fixed on the horizon where the river met the sky. Holmes's lips twitched, a faint smile that held no warmth. "A man like Svengali does not vanish," he said, his voice a quiet blade cutting through the morning's haze. "He retreats, he adapts, he waits. His web is broken, but its strands linger, and we must ensure they do not take root again." He moved forward, his cane tapping against the wooden planks of the dock, the sound a counterpoint to the river's soft lapping. His mind was a map, tracing the threads of Svengali's influence. The theatre, the victims, the name Trilby, a key to his past and perhaps his future. They followed the river's edge, the air growing sharper, the scent of salt and decay stronger now, mingling with the faint sweetness of rotting wood from the pilings. The docks were a world unto themselves, a place where the city's underbelly was laid bare, where sailors and thieves moved in equal measure, their steps silent in the fog's fading embrace. Holmes's eyes scanned the warehouses, their walls weathered and stained, their windows dark save for the occasional flicker of a lantern within. He noted the signs of passage, a scuff of mud on a doorstep, a discarded cigarette end, its tip still smouldering faintly, a faint scratch on a lock that spoke of haste. A sound caught his attention, a soft hum, almost too faint to hear, drifting from a narrow alley between two warehouses. It was not the rough song of a sailor or the cry of a vendor, but something softer, more deliberate, a melody that carried the weight of memory. Holmes's steps slowed, his cane resting lightly against the ground, his senses attuned to the air's subtle shifts. Watson followed, his breath steady but his hand tightening on his revolver, a silent acknowledgement of the danger that lingered. The alley was a tunnel of shadows, its walls slick with damp, the air thick with the scent of tar and the faint sickly sweetness of opium smoke drifting from some hidden den. The hum grew clearer, a voice that seemed to weave through the air, its cadence familiar yet chilling. Holmes moved forward, his steps silent now, his coat brushing against the bricks, the wool catching faintly on their rough edges. The alley opened into a small courtyard, its cobblestones uneven, gleaming faintly in the dawn's light. There, seated on a crate, was Svengali, his figure hunched, his eyes dark and unyielding, fixed on a young man who stood before him, his face serene but empty, his hands trembling as if caught in a dream. Holmes paused, his mind racing, cataloguing the scene, the young man's tattered coat, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, the way his lips moved in silent echo of Svengali's hum. This was no banker or heiress, but a common soul, a dock worker perhaps, caught in the web's last strands. Svengali's power was not gone, merely redirected, seeking new vessels in the city's forgotten corners. Holmes's cane tapped once, a sharp sound that cut through the hum, and Svengali's head snapped up, his eyes meeting Holmes's with a flicker of recognition, of defiance. "You are persistent, Mr. Holmes," Svengali said, his voice a low hum, each word a note designed to soothe, to sway. "But the city is vast, its mines endless. You cannot save them all." He rose, his movements fluid, almost serpentine, the silver ring on his finger catching the dawn's light, its etched symbols a faint echo of his power. Holmes stepped forward, his voice steady, a counterpoint to Svengali's melody. "I do not seek to save them all," he said, his eyes locked on the man's, searching for the crack in his facade. "I seek to stop you." He moved closer, his cane resting lightly against the ground, its tip a point of contact with the world's solidity. Watson stood at his side, his revolver drawn now, its metal glinting faintly in the light, a silent promise of resolve. The young man swayed, his eyes flickering with a spark of awareness, and Holmes spoke to him, his voice soft but firm, a lifeline through the haze. "You are not his," he said, his words a steady rhythm cutting through Svengali's spell. "Your will is your own." The young man blinked, his hands steadying, his face clearing as he stepped back, breaking free from the hum's embrace. Svengali's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing, a flicker of unease betraying his control. Holmes pressed forward, his voice a relentless tide, laying out the pattern of Svengali's web. The theatre, the victims, the name Trilby, a thread that led back to Paris, to a past where Svengali had honed his art. The man's hands trembled, his voice fraying, a melody unravelling at the edges. The courtyard seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with the scent of tar and damp stone, the faint taste of salt on the tongue. Holmes's words were a beacon, calling the young man back, dismantling the last strands of Svengali's influence. The man's shoulders slumped, his presence shrinking, a shadow dissolving in the dawn's light. He turned, his steps faltering, and slipped into the alley's shadows, his figure swallowed by the city's maze. The young man stood free, his eyes clear, his breath steady, and he nodded to Holmes, a silent thanks before disappearing into the dock's bustle. The city was walking now, its sounds rising. The clatter of hooves, the shout of a vendor, the soft hum of life reclaiming its rhythm. The air was lighter, the fog fully lifted, the sunlight glinting off the river like a promise of renewal. Holmes stood in the courtyard, his cane resting against the ground, his mind a fortress that had withstood the storm. Watson lowered his revolver, his face a mix of relief and awe, the weight of the night lifting from his shoulders. They returned to Baker Street as the city came alive, its streets a tapestry of struggle and hope. The air was warm now, carrying the scent of fresh bread and the faint tang of coal, the sounds of London a chorus of survival. Holmes sat by the fire, his pipe in hand, the smoke curling upward like a ghost of the fog. The web was broken, Svengali's influence scattered, but the city remained a labyrinth, its secrets buried deep. Holmes knew he would walk its streets, his reason a shield against the shadows, his resolve a light that would not fade. Holmes and Watson stepped into the dawn, the theatre behind them a silent witness to the battle won. The fog was lifting, its grey veil parting to reveal the sun's first rays, glinting off the cobblestones like flecks of hope in a weary city. The air was sharp with morning chill, laced with the acrid bite of coal smoke and the faint tang of river mud, softened by the fleeting sweetness of bread baking nearby. London stirred, its pulse quickening, the clatter of hooves, the cry of a paper vendor, the creak of a cart's wheel through the muck. This was 1895, a city of scars and resilience, where the poor huddled in alleys thick with refuse, and the wealthy hid their fears behind polished doors. Holmes's coat hung heavy with the night's damp, its wool rough against his shoulders, steeped in the scent of soot and mist. His cane tapped lightly against the cobblestones, a rhythm anchoring his restless thoughts. Watson walked beside him, his breath a faint cloud, his boots scuffing softly, his face set with quiet resolve. The victory in the theatre, Trilby freed, the banker, heiress and politician released from Svengali's spell, was a triumph, but Holmes's mind churned. Svengali had slipped into the shadows, his influence a lingering poison, and the city's pulse still carried the echo of his hum. Their path led to Covent Garden, where Trilby rested under a physician's care. The streets were alive, their shadows softening in the dawn's light, the air thick with the sourness of spilled ale and the faint perfume of wilting flowers from market stalls. Holmes's senses catalogued every detail. The scuff of a boot in the mud, the glint of a discarded coin, the twitch of a curtain above. What might it feel like to walk these streets, the air heavy with the city's breath, each step a brush with its hidden truths? This was not the London of grand dreams, but a city of raw survival, its every breath laced with coal's bitter tang and decay's faint sweetness. The physician's house was a modest brick building, its windows glowing with candlelight, the air heavy with herbs and antiseptic. Inside, the rooms were warm, scented with lavender and the faint metallic tang of medical instruments. Trilby sat by a fire, her face pale but her eyes clearer, her hands steady as she held a cup of tea, its steam curling like a ghost of the fog. She looked up as Holmes and Watson entered, her lips trembling into a faint smile, a spark of her old self shining through. Holmes studied her, noting the faint tremor in her fingers, the way her gaze flickered to the window, as if expecting a shadow. "You are safe," he said, his voice steady, a counterpoint to the city's restless pulse. "His hold is broken." Trilby nodded, her voice soft, a melody reclaiming its strength. "I hear my own song now," she said, her words a quiet victory, though the weight of her ordeal lingered in her eyes. Watson's face softened, his hand resting on a chair, the wood creaking faintly. "Will she sing again?" he asked, his voice low, a doctor's concern blending with a friend's hope. The physician, grey-haired and steady-handed, nodded. "In time," he said, the fire's crackle a backdrop to his words. How would it seem to stand in that warm room, the scent of lavender in the air, knowing a mind had been freed from shadows? Holmes's thoughts were elsewhere, tracing Svengali's escape, the man's influence a thread yet to be severed. He stepped to the window, the glass cold against his fingertips, the street below a blur of vendors and carts, the air heavy with damp stone and rotting fruit. They left Trilby to her recovery, the physician's house a haven in the city's storm. The streets outside were brighter now, the sunlight cutting through the last wisps of fog, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. The air was warm, carrying the scent of fresh bread from a nearby bakery, the faint tang of coal smoke, and a soft breeze from the Thames, its waters glinting like a ribbon of steel in the morning light. London was fully awake, its pulse a chorus of survival. The clatter of hooves on the street, the sharp cry of a costermonger hawking apples, the low hum of voices weaving through the crowd. This was 1895, a city of struggle and hope, where the poor scraped by in alleys reeking of refuse, and the wealthy hid their secrets behind locked doors and guarded smiles. Holmes's mind was a furnace, its flames fed by the hunt for Svengali's final traces. His coat, still heavy with the night's damp, hung rough against his shoulders, the wool steeped in the city's breath of soot and mist. His cane tapped lightly against the cobblestones, a steady rhythm grounding his thoughts as he led Watson toward the docks, where Svengali's shadow was most likely to linger. The streets were a maze, their walls stained with soot, the air thick with the sourness of spilled ale and the faint perfume of wilting flowers left unsold by a vendor's cart. Holmes's senses were alive, noting every detail, the scuff of a boot in the mud, the glint of a broken bottle in the gutter, the faint twitch of a curtain in a window above. What might it feel like to tread these streets, the city's pulse thrumming beneath your feet, each sound a whisper of its hidden truths. The docks were a world apart, a place of labour and shadow, where the air was heavy with the scent of tar and salt, the faint metallic tang of rusted iron from the wharves. The river lapped against the wooden pilings, its surface gleaming in the sunlight, the sounds of the docks a chorus, the creak of ropes tightening, the shout of a dock worker hauling crates, the soft splash of water against the hulls of moored boats. Holmes paused at the edge of a pier, his eyes scanning the warehouses, their weathered walls stained with time, their windows dark save for the occasional flicker of a lantern within. He noted the signs of recent passage, a scuff of mud on a doorstep, a cigarette end still smouldering faintly, a fresh scratch on a rusted lock, speaking of haste and secrecy. A soft hum drifted from a narrow alley between two warehouses, a melody that chilled the air despite the sun's warmth. It was Svengali's voice, its cadence faint but unmistakable, weaving through the morning like a thread of lingering poison. Holmes moved forward, his steps silent, his cane resting lightly against the ground, its tip a point of contact with the world's solidity. Watson followed, his revolver drawn, its metal glinting faintly in the light, his breath steady but his eyes sharp with the soldier's instinct. The alley was a tunnel of shadows, its walls slick with damp, the air thick with the scent of tar and the faint sickly sweetness of opium smoke drifting from some hidden den. The hum grew clearer, a low vibration that seemed to pulse in time with the city's heartbeat. The alley opened into a small courtyard, its cobblestones uneven, gleaming faintly in the sunlight. Svengali stood alone, his figure hunched, his eyes dark and unyielding, facing a young dock worker whose face was serene but empty, his lips moving in silent echo of the hum. The man's hands trembled, his tattered coat swaying as if caught in a dream. Holmes's cane tapped once, a sharp sound that cut through the melody like a blade through silk. Svengali's head snapped up, his eyes meeting Holmes's, a flicker of defiance burning in their depths, but also a shadow of weariness, as if the weight of his own web had begun to drag him down. "You are persistent, Mr. Holmes," Svengali said, his voice a low hum, fraying at the edges, each word a note struggling to hold its power. "The city is vast, its mines endless. You cannot sever every thread." His silver ring caught the sunlight, its etched symbols a fading echo of his influence, glinting like a dying star. He stepped forward, his movements fluid but faltering, as if the stage he once commanded was crumbling beneath him. Holmes's voice was a steady counterpoint, sharp and unyielding. "Your web is broken," he said, his eyes locked on Svengali's, searching for the crack in his facade, the flaw in his design. "The city is not yours to command." He stepped closer, his cane resting lightly against the cobblestones, the wood cool and solid, grounding him in the moment. Watson stood at his side, his revolver steady, his face a mask of resolve, the sunlight casting sharp shadows across his features. Holmes spoke of Trilby, her voice now rising in Covent Garden's halls, reclaimed from the shadows. He spoke of the banker, his steps steady once more, walking the docks with purpose, the heiress, her will restored, her jewels no longer scattered, the politician, his fire rekindled in Parliament's chambers. Each was a thread pulled free, a proof of Svengali's unravelling. His words were a rhythm, a tide washing away the last strands of the web, his logic a light piercing the courtyard's shadows. The dockworker blinked, his eyes clearing, his hands steadying as he stepped back, breaking free from the hum's embrace. His breath caught, a faint sound in the silence, and he nodded to Holmes, a silent thanks before slipping into the dock's bustle. Svengali's smile faltered, his shoulders slumping, his presence shrinking as the air grew lighter. His eyes darted to the alley's mouth, as if seeking escape. But Holmes stepped forward, his voice soft but final, a verdict delivered in the quiet of the morning. "Your song is ended," he said, each word a weight, a seal on the city's freedom. Svengali's hands trembled, the silver ring slipping from his finger, clattering against the cobblestones, its sound a faint echo of his lost power. He turned, his steps faltering, his figure dissolving into the alley's shadows, swallowed by the city's maze. Holmes watched him go, his mind certain that Svengali's influence was broken, his web scattered to the winds, the man himself a ghost fading into London's depths. The courtyard was still now, the air warm with the scent of tar and salt softened by the river's breeze. The sunlight glinted off the cobblestones, casting a glow that pushed back the last traces of shadow. Holmes stood at the centre, his cane resting against the ground, his thoughts turning to the city beyond, a labyrinth of struggle and hope, its pulse a testament to resilience. Watson lowered his revolver, his face softening, the weight of the night lifting from his shoulders. The docks hummed with life, the sounds of labour rising, the creak of ropes, the shout of a worker, the soft lapping of the river against the pilings. They returned to Baker Street, the streets now bright with midday light, the air thick with the scent of fresh bread, coal smoke, and the faint sweetness of flowers from a vendor's cart. The city was a tapestry, its threads woven from countless lives, its scars worn proudly. At 221B, Holmes sat by the fire, its warmth a contrast to the morning's chill, the air heavy with the scent of tobacco and the faint tang of tea cooling on the sideboard. Watson sat across from him, his notebook open, the scratch of his pen a steady rhythm, capturing the tale's end. The room was a haven, its walls a bulwark against the city's chaos, the fire's crackle a reminder of the light that had prevailed. Holmes drew on his pipe, the smoke curling upward like a ghost of the fog, his thoughts drifting to Trilby, whose voice now filled London's halls, a melody of freedom reclaimed. The banker walked the docks with purpose, the heiress moved through society with newfound strength, the politician's voice echoed in Parliament once more. The city was free, its pulse steady, its shadows pushed back by the light of reason. How would it seem to sit in that warm room, the fire's glow casting shadows, knowing a city's heart had been freed from a silent chain? Holmes's gaze shifted to the window, where the sunlight streamed through, glinting off the glass like a promise of renewal. The city remained a labyrinth, its secrets buried deep, but his mind was a beacon, his resolve a light that would not fade. The web was broken, Svengali's song silenced, and London breathed anew, its streets a testament to the triumph of will over shadow. That's the end of our tale tonight. Where are you tuning in from? A foggy London alley, a rooftop in Seoul, or a quiet kitchen in Buenos Aires? If these echoes stirred something in you, leave a light on, subscribe, share, and step back into the mist with us next time. Until then, stay curious and stay close.